There you go. Now you heard it. Now you heard it. This meeting is being recorded. Yes. So our guest today, Sara Moslener, besides being a close and dear friend, she's a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Central Michigan University, where she teaches courses at the intersection of religion, race, and sexuality. She's the author of a book titled Virgin Nation, Sexual Purity and American Adolescence, which was published by Oxford University Press, I think it's 2015 or 16. And now she's working on a follow-up project of that, which she calls the After Purity Project, which includes interviews from people that have grown out of the evangelical purity culture. And a short time ago, given what's happening in the country and at the intersection of race and religion, we were talking about Christian nationalism, how strange it felt to me as a foreigner, as an immigrant. And so we decided, she was maybe inspired, I don't know, to by that and other conversation for sure, to start thinking more about it. So this is a beginning of a new research that she's going to present to us. One more thing, during the conversation that will last, her talk will last for about 30 to 40 minutes, you may write your questions, including questions of understanding, in the chat. And you can keep writing your questions in the chat even later on, and we will see how to present the questions depending on how many they are to our esteemed guest. So Dr.
Christ Church for several years, so I am recognizing some names. It is wonderful to be with you all and let you know and have a conversation with you about the work I've been doing around sexual purity culture and evangelical purity culture, and now white Christian nationalism. So I just want to be sure I am sharing my screen right now, which includes a PowerPoint, and I want to make sure that is visible to everyone. So as I do with my students, if I could just get a thumbs up or thumbs down. I think there might be those emojis on from people. Whoops, sorry about that. Okay, so is everyone seeing this first title page? Great, thank you very much. So the title of my talk today, Purity, Race, and Christian Nationalism. And as you can see from these images, the location where we're going to ask questions about the relationship between sexual purity and Christian nationalism is the symbolism of white womanhood. So that's where I want us to think today about what white womanhood has symbolized and continues to symbolize. So I have these two images of here on the left, we have two white women who are kneeling in prayer. And this is a photograph from the parking lot of the Maricopa County Elections Office on November 4. So these are women who are praying for the election of Donald Trump. It is certainly not the only image that we have, but I just want us to take note of their expressions, right? So we see their expression of religious piety, but also a great deal of distress. And that distress only makes sense when we understand that these women are concerned not just with the reelection of a single political candidate, but they are distressed over the fear that the loss of that particular candidate is going to disrupt the special relationship between God and the United States. Because for people who, for Christians who supported Donald Trump, that was their understanding. So, uh, so we have, so that is the image here on the left. On the right is that is the images of Lady Liberty, Lady Justice, right, drawing on sort of the Greco-Roman motif of goddesses. And here she is, what she's doing is she is leading progress, right? You can see her laying down the telephone wires, and you can see the trains coming after her. So she is leading the way, and in doing so is displacing the native population. And this for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the 19th century was American progress. So the displacement of native peoples and the expansion of white settler colonialism. So I just wanted to offer these as a way to sort of sit with the various meanings of white womanhood and think about what these images might have in common and what insight they might offer us into sexual purity in relationship to Christian nationalism. So the next thing I want to do is tell you about the questions I've been asking since my last book came out. The questions I've really been sitting with have been about the relationship between sexual purity and white supremacy. Now, I am a historian, and so a lot of my starting points end up in the 19th century. For today, that is just a historical scope that we can't that is really not going to help us. So for the purposes of this talk, I am going to be focused on a starting point of the late 1970s, early 1980s. But we will have to take a dip back into the 19th century at least once. Especially to think about this second question: how has the racial formation of white women been shaped by a belief that sexual purity is in service to an ordered and secure nation state? So sexual purity is about the control of women's bodies. It is about a particular it's the recognition that only certain expressions and practices of sexuality are morally correct, and therefore in service to the well-being of the nation state. This is the larger argument of my first book. And so I'm not going to unpack that here, but just to let you know, that's sort of our starting point, that there is a very clear connection between popular discourses about sexuality, especially about women's sexuality, eventually about adolescent sexuality, and national thriving and even well-being. Okay. So when this phrase white Christian nationalism started popping up everywhere, and it did sort of just, I think this past fall, it was something that many of us who study US religious history recognized as something that's been around for a very, very long time. However, two sociologists, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. I'm going to show their book right here. I don't know if you can see this or not since I'm sharing my screen, but they have a book called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. And they use the Baylor Religion Survey, which is a really large scale survey of people's religious beliefs and practices. And they came up with ways of with this category of Christian nationalism and how to sort of identify Christian nationalist thought. Not a new idea, just sort of a different configuration of words. I realized that the argument professionals take. Okay, all right, there we go. Quick recovery. That's what I like to see. So yeah, so these are the guiding questions that I have been working with. And ultimately my conclusion will be whether or not it's evident today, because this is very much a work in progress, is that we need to understand evangelical purity culture as a sexual ethic. And it is a sexual ethic that promotes the ideals of white Christian nationalism. So I hope to show you that today. And of course, I hope and look forward to all of your questions. And I hope, and of course, if there is, let me say this, as I do with my students. I've been teaching online all year. With each slide, I will pause and see if there are any questions for clarification, and I'm happy to answer those throughout the talk. Uh, more in-depth questions, I will wait until the end of the talk to answer those. And I think Gigi mentioned this already, that you're welcome to certainly put those questions in the chat, and I will go to the chat when I am done going through my slides. So yeah, so since we are here at our first slide, any questions? So I will be defining evangelical purity culture and white Christian nationalism, and also critical race theory. And so but if there is anything else that anyone needs clarification on, please do not feel shy about asking. So any initial needs for clarification at this point, and feel free to either, pop a question in the chat or unmute yourself. Okie doke. I will move on then. So I usually don't spend a lot of time talking about my research methodology in talks like this, but I felt that it was important because one of my research methods is critical race theory, which you may have heard of. In recent days, it is getting a lot of attention, of a lot of opposition. And so critical race theory is a method I have been working with for almost 20 years. My work is especially focused on the history of white racial identity. And this is going all the way back to my master's thesis. So it's been interesting to see the increased attention to critical race theory and and a lot of the misinformation that is out there. And right now there are some pretty fierce debates in state governments and also in among school boards about critical race theory. So I wanted to offer some clarification. And so this is a very bad PowerPoint slide because it has all the words. A good PowerPoint slide should not be this wordy, but I wanted to offer this to you. So if you want to jot any of this down, you know that there's a school board meeting coming up where critical race theory is going to be discussed, or you just want to understand it more, please feel free to use this. So critical race theory is the academic study of race as a socio-historical construct. Okay, it asserts that race is not a biological fact. There is no genetic or biological evidence that helps us distinguish a race. So what race is then is over time and space the result of attaching particular meanings to biological features within a single group. Now, when early anthropologists were inventing the concept of race, and it is very much a human invention, they were using the biological marker of skulls. Okay, today we don't associate skulls with race, but that's where it started. And they were doing this work in order to establish racial hierarchies and make scientific arguments about which groups were genetically, spiritually, and intellectually superior and which were inferior. And this is a project that would last for hundreds of years, both inside and outside of academic spaces. It was supported by religious argumentation, by legal argumentation, and is the process by which we now have the racial categories that we use. Think about forms that you fill out, and that sort of thing. But these categories, we have to understand, are not right, are not biological. They are not sort of natural or God-given uh, traits, and people have made the argument that it is so. But we have to understand, when we're talking about the formation of racial identities, they are the result of political, legal, and religious norms. Okay, and so in order to understand a particular historical racial identity or racial identity group, we need to understand its history. And so this is where we get into debates over how textbooks depict slavery. What is the language that is being used? And so this is critical race theory as I use it, as I teach it. I have taught a course for 7 years on the history of religious and racial discrimination. So this is well within my area of expertise. So I want to pause now and see if there are any questions about critical race theory in general, or about how I make use of it. And again, please feel free to drop a question in the chat. Ooh, sorry, I do this all the time. My apologies. Or unmute yourself. As it happens, I'm going to a meeting tomorrow about critical race theory because people have been, it's starting to come up at school board meetings, and we expect it to come up on Monday. So this is happening right now, this conversation. Okay, so moving on to Christian nationalism. Perry and Whitehead define it as an ideology which advocates for the fusion of American civic life and a particular kind of Christian identity and culture. Now, I am a historian of evangelicalism, and so I am always looking at evangelicals and people who identify as Bible-believing, Christ-following Christians, and how they live that out in their lives. And a lot of white evangelicalism, especially in the last 5 years, and I would say even before that, has been very much aligned with Christian nationalism. Now, that doesn't mean, as Perry and Whitehead tell us, that only white evangelicals are Christian nationalists. There are, people can be from all sorts of different religious groups, even Episcopalians, and Roman Catholics, and sometimes there are even non-whites who embrace Christian nationalism, because it is the belief that, a certain understanding of Christianity should be fully fused with notions of, of, U.S. democracy. That we need to work to maintain this special relationship between God and America. And when that relationship is threatened, the nation is threatened. So that is Christian nationalism. This was something that, when I was growing up evangelical, I was very much aware of. At my Christian high school, every year, we took a trip down to Washington, D.C. to protest abortion in the nation's capital at the March for Life. I did this every year in high school. It was very much a part of my Christian identity, first and foremost, but also my being what I believe to be a responsible citizen of the United States. Even though I was at an age where I couldn't vote. And so, what's interesting is that I didn't realize at the time that people my age were being sort of called up to service to embody the ideals of a white Christian nationalism. And um, and that there were organizations that were working to really make this alignment a reality, and that my advocacy or my work to end abortion, and also public statements I made about the teaching of abstinence only education, were very much me responding to that call. What's interesting about Christian nationalism is that it positions itself as a minority sentiment. And that as a group, it is marginalized in the broader U.S. Political and religious landscape. Christian Smith, the sociologist, who's studied and written a great deal about evangelicalism, uses the phrase an embattled minority, that evangelicals take this posture as being embattled. And we have seen that, especially in the last 4 years, as a way that that sort of white conservatives um, can sort of claim moral authority and claim a right to be heard. What's interesting is that organizations that are doing this work, such as the Family Research Council, the American Defense League, have modeled themselves after civil rights organizations, such as the NAACP and the American Defamation League. This is according to another sociologist, Gerardo Marti, who wrote an excellent book about white evangelicals and support for Trump. So I learned this from him, that these organizations, although they represented majority groups, were styling themselves after minoritized groups so that they can claim a certain level of moral authority and enlarge themselves, and say, we are minorities, we have the right to be present. But of course, they are not a minority, they are a majority. So it becomes a tactic for their own enlargement and increased dominance, rather than an actual act of justice. Let's see. Oh, yes. So thank you for asking that. The WG down in the right-hand corner of this woman's sign is a reference to QAnon. So this is a woman who is a QAnon follower. The phrase actually means "we go one, we go all." I'm not sure who that is quoting, but it's sort of a mantra. So this is a way of one way that you can identify someone who follows QAnon. Yeah. Let's see. So any other clarifying questions here? So just another image. I believe this is also from November 4, around that time, of someone sort of rallying, but just this sense that a win for Trump is a win for God, right? That it is a way of maintaining this special relationship between God and the United States. And that relationship needs to stay intact in order for the United States to thrive. Okay. Now, okay, so I'm going to move on, because oh, one of the places where evangelicals have really succeeded at positioning themselves as a minoritized group has been evangelical purity culture. Okay. And of course, as you look at this image, what you're seeing is not an image of a minoritized group, but an image of a group that has fully ensconced itself into the national life of the nation. And so this is the first national display of True Love Waits purity pledges. Starting in 1993, True Love Waits of the Southern Baptist Convention began encouraging young people to take pledges to sexual purity, focusing mostly on not having sexual intercourse before marriage. But it was much more than that. And they would ask young people to sign cards. And that became a phenomenon and a practice that other organizations, even secular organizations, picked up. And so they asked young people to sign their cards and send them. And at this event in 1994, True Love Waits and the many young people who were there representing them took those cards. So this is about 211,000, I believe was the number, posted onto little stakes and posted into the ground. So that is the display that we are looking at here. And so from the very beginning, True Love Waits was one of the earliest organizations. And if you know anything about the Southern Baptist Convention, if they go anywhere, they go big. And this was only the first in many large-scale displays of purity cards. And it is, of course, not at all incidental that it happened on the grounds of the National Mall, that this was making a direct statement about the decision these youth were making in relationship to US national identity. So that was something that was very much intended from the beginning. To dig into that a little further, I want to show you the True Love Waits Bible, which was printed about the same time. At one point, I think I owned about 12 of these because um, I bought them off of Amazon. I bought them as used copies, and so I was able to sort of read people's notes and sort of learn a lot about the readers of these Bibles, which was really fascinating. And so, but what I want to show you are the remarks of Richard Ross, one of the founders of True Love Waits. He is still a spokesperson for True Love Waits. He is a professor of youth ministry at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And this is what he writes. So listen to this carefully. Over the centuries, God has chosen to initiate sweeping revival and awakenings through youth and young adults. In America, God has sparked revivals among those just completing their teenage years, frequently on college campuses. Even now, signs of revival on numerous college campuses suggest a beginning. It's really interesting because in '94, I was in college and I remember those revivals happening and hearing about them happening at other places. And then when they came to my Christian college, they just completely fell flat. So it's pretty interesting interesting to kind of think back on that. Anyway, he goes on to say, I believe that it will be pure, courageous, true love teenagers and young adults whom God will be using to change the very fabric of our society. God will receive even greater glory, and then we will know the rest of the True Love Wade story. So here we have a very clear view of their intent to connect the sexual purity, right? These pure, courageous teenagers with the thriving of the nation, right? With the revival, with the moral revival of the nation. And so this is somewhat curious unless we go back to the 19th century and we look at 19th century constructions of white womanhood, which will eventually be transferred onto this new category of adolescent in the early 20th century. So here's where we're going to pivot back to the 19th century just briefly. Okay, so in the 19th century, you have nationalistic images of white womanhood. So think Lady Liberty, Lady Justice, and that these represent the promise of civilizational advancement. And of course, we need to remember that, the promise of the shining city on the hill was only possible because the nation was dependent on slave labor, and because it had displaced and massacred the indigenous populations. And so all of this rests on a particular history of what we would call white supremacy, of European Christian supremacy, there were arguments that Native Americans just were not fit to survive the move into civilization and what white Europeans were bringing. And of course, all of this was blessed by God, as we saw, in the image of American progress, that it was about sort of out with the old, which is a very kind of cliche way of saying, genocide and enslavement, and in with the new, which was sort of, the superior white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. So out of that comes this argument about ideal womanhood that is inherently racialized. Okay, Barbara Welter, a historian in the 1970s, is going to name it the cult of true womanhood. And what she did is she went back and she looked at 19th century novels and magazines. One of the most prominent was Godey's Lady's Book. And this image, called The Spear of Woman, was a way of promoting ideal womanhood. And so, this is what women's magazines do. They promote ideals of womanhood. And so that's what she was studying. And she discovered there were 4 traits of this ideal womanhood: religious piety, sexual purity, which at the time would have been called social purity because these were middle-class Victorians who would not speak the word sex, domesticity, and submission. Now, what's going to happen is that women who don't necessarily embody or even admire this ideal are still going to claim parts of it to move forward their own moral agendas, especially religious piety and sexual purity. So women like Frances Willard, who was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the largest women's political organization in the United States in the 19th century, is going to embrace these as ideals for women. And unfortunately, and what comes along with that is um, the white racial formation, which is very much steeped in white supremacy. Okay, so it makes sense then when you have white women who are advocating for the right to vote, you know, they're using arguments about, yes, we are religiously pious, we are sexually pure. This is why we have moral authority and why we should be given, you know, increased political power and influence. And they would make that argument over and against Black men who were granted the right to vote in the Reconstruction amendments, and so they were trying to push back against that. So this is something that historians, that 19th century historians know, that white women sort of use their racial power to gain their own political power, and this is characteristic of first wave feminism. So, so this is a construction that continues to be to show up in feminist conversations, and why people who are committed to feminism need to also think about the impact of white supremacy on the assumptions about womanhood. But the reason why those are there is because of the assumed presumption that white women are naturally religiously pious and that they are naturally sexually pure. Okay, and that's where and so that's where I want to shift us back to the present and to evangelical purity culture, because evangelical purity culture does not make sense unless you see it as an attempt to revive 19th century ideals of white womanhood. Okay, so so these are two portraits from a series by David Magnuson, a Scandinavian photographer. He did a whole series in which he asked fathers and their daughters who were attending purity balls in Colorado if he could photograph them. And so he has this a whole book, a whole series of images like this. And so he asked the fathers and daughters to dress in the clothes that they wore to their purity ball, and then to assume a position that embodied their understanding of sexual purity. And as you can see here, the images are very much about fatherly protection and female vulnerability. And so what the purity movement is doing is using white evangelical adolescents to embody. Here's what I want to argue, and I'll break it down in a second here. They're wanting them to argue a kind of, make the argument for a kind of national innocence. Now, what does this have to do with nationalism? I can tell you that the purity balls were started in Colorado Springs by a family who work for by a man whose name is completely escaping me now, but who is the director of men's initiatives for the American Family Association. Sorry, and that's not it. I've forgotten the name of this organization, which I already mentioned. Yes, the Family Research Council, which is the political wing of Focus on the Family, if you know your evangelical organizations. And so, so the person who started it is doing so in Colorado Springs. And if you know anything about Colorado Springs, it is a fusion of the culture there is a fusion of evangelical Christianity and US militarism, because there's an Air Force military base there. And so when people would attend these purity balls, so kind of think a cotillion or father-daughter dance, but really, really upscale, there would be, men in uniform and the sword tunnel, which, fathers and their daughters would walk through. So the idea of the father as protector in the way that, the military protects, the nation state protects the family is very much infused in these events. And so, Brandy Wilson is the name of the person who founded Purity Balls. And so what Magnuson is capturing in these portraits is more than a father-daughter relationship in the way that the images of women praying, in the parking lot of election offices is more than just an act of religious piety. It is a representation of how white women and girls maintain the right to physical and other forms of protection by acknowledging the authority of their fathers. Okay, so Christian nationalism promotes a patriarchal structure for family and nation, with the proper family ordering mirroring that of the nation state. In this social order, white womanhood stands for purity and innocence. That is, the sexual innocence of white womanhood continues to serve as a representation of the racial innocence of the nation state. So I'm going to unpack that a little more with some examples. But I also want to add that the racial formation of white womanhood is only possible because it is counterbalanced by the opposite representations of Blackness. And so in my field, there's increasing talk about anti-Blackness and how, part of white supremacy, white supremacist thinking is an embedded anti-Blackness. And when we look at the history of white women and sexual innocence, we know that this is a formulation that has been used to keep the races separate and has been used to justify significant racial violence, especially in the form of racial terror lynchings. We can go back even further to talk about these constructions of femininity, of racialized femininity in the context of slavery, right? So this can't exist without the denigration of women of color, okay, and also of men of color. Lynchings happened because it was presumed a white woman was attacked by a Black man, and just the rumor of that could set off incredible destruction. We've just passed the 100th, the centennial anniversary of the Tulsa race massacres. And that started because there was a rumor that a young white woman was attacked by a young Black man in an elevator. He was apprehended, but it turns out she never filed a complaint. He was let go, and so it was it was not what it was rumored to be, and yet that did not matter. That one rumor set off one of the most devastating attacks and expressions of anti-Blackness by white citizens in the United States. And it was state-sanctioned violence. Okay, that's how powerful the symbolism of white womanhood, and especially as a symbol of innocence, is. Okay, and so I'm trying to understand, how does that function today, right? How do we see that function today? And so I have 3 examples of that I want to share with you, 1 from a film and 2 from actual real life. Okay, so I want to talk about Rose Amy, and Ashley. We've also come to call these people Karens, if you know the Karen meme, which is again not a new thing. People of color have always had names for white women who try to use their racial power um, over people of color. And so this is what we see happening in these three cases. So Rose is a character in the film Get Out, a really excellent film. I won't spoil anything for you if you haven't seen it, but she is a white woman from a liberal white family who is in a relationship with a Black man named Chris. She brings him home to meet her family, presumably very liberal. There's a big joke about how, her father would vote for Barack Obama a third time. Ha ha ha. But Get Out, if you know it, is a horror film. And the horror that Chris has stepped into is that this white family harvests the genetic superiority of the genetically superior DNA and other parts of Black bodies for their own purposes. Okay, so right, so it's a horror show, right? And so the whole film is about Chris trying to get out. And he does eventually, but before that, he has a physical altercation with Rose, and they both end up laying in the street, kind of beaten up and bloody. And then you hear the sound of a police car. And as you hear the sound of the police car, all you see is Rose's face, and you see this slow grin spread across her face. And in that grin, this is really incredible filmmaking. The filmmaker Jordan Peele has encapsulated a whole history of white women using the presumption of innocence to assert their racial power. Okay, because she knows that she's going to be the one presumed innocent. He's going to be the one presumed guilty. Okay, and so we have that particular moment. Now, I won't go on to tell you what happens next. It's the very end of the movie, but that one moment in the film just is so profound, and is what I have been trying to think deeply about. Okay. Next, we have Amy Cooper. You have probably heard about her. It's kind of incredible that her story was so dominated the headlines because it happened at the same time as the murder of George Floyd. I mean, I think it was, the same weekend. I mean, very close together. But, here's a white woman walking her dog in Central Park without a leash, as is required. A Black man comes along, requests she put her dog on a leash. She resists. He starts filming her, and she kind of goes into full-on meltdown, calls the police, and says to the police, "A Black man is threatening my life." And so it's that phrase that is so chilling and so evocative of the work that white womanhood can do. She knows, right? She, like the character of Rose, is banking on the belief that the police are going to be racially biased toward him, right? That she is going to be the one presumed innocent and he will not be. And I think this is why her story so captured national attention, because we are really coming to terms with the harm and the violence that has shaped white womanhood. Okay. So I want to move on here to Ashley Babbitt. So Ashley Babbitt was part of the capital assault on December 6th. You can see her here with her MAGA hat. I think this is actually her on her way to DC. And she was one of the people who, one of the insurrectionists who went into the Capitol building and doing and sort of wreaking havoc. So they are, trespassing illegally, all sorts of problematic and violent behavior. I mean, it was an assault on our nation's capital, and had our elected officials fleeing for fear of their lives. And so she, in the course of this, she was shot and killed by, I believe, a Capitol police officer, but someone who was trying to control the crowd and get them out. And so she died on that day. On that same day, um, people are starting to talk about her, who she was. One of those people was Tucker Carlson from Fox News, whose rhetoric is very much in line with white Christian nationalism. And so it was interesting to me to hear how he described her before he knew who she was, okay, because we didn't quite know who she was, didn't know her background, right, on the day that she was killed. And so what's interesting, so first, Carlson will initially refer to Babbitt as a girl. She's 36 years old. She was 36 years old, okay? And then he goes on to say, why did this woman go to the rally in the first place? We do not know anything about her, but she did not look particularly radical. She bears no resemblance to the angry children we have seen wrecking our cities, pasty, entitled reckless nihilists, setting fires, spray painting slogans on statues. She didn't look like that. The woman in the Capitol hallway pretty much looked like anyone else. So why was she there? And this response, right? So Carlson's response, if we take it at face value, which, is a little dicey when we're talking about Tucker Carlson, but we can see his cognitive dissonance, right? Trying to make sense of a white woman who has positioned herself in opposition to the nation state. Okay. Now he will go on to say, like, okay, we need to hold off on our judgments here, but like, she doesn't look like the kind of person to do this, right? She was presumed innocent, and Carlson could not figure out who she was, why she was there, what was this all about. And so that is really interesting. And even on discussion boards online, as people came to know who Babbitt was, she was referred to as an innocent girl. She was referred to as a martyr. And so she became a kind of the propaganda of white womanhood, and as a way to sort of be positioned as the victim in this situation, as a way to further rally white Christian nationalists to the cause of opposing the election results. Okay, so we're getting close to the end, folks. Thanks for hanging in there with me. So in conclusion, I want to take us back to these images. What these stories demonstrate is that white women's innocence is a powerful mythology that shapes national ideologies about race, sexuality, national survival, and even national security. Whether or not white women deploy this trope in a moment of personal crisis, it doesn't matter. White Christian nationalism allows them to do so and even gives them the responsibility to do so. So, through white women's presumed vulnerability, sexual purity, and religious piety, white Christian nationalists uphold myths of the nation's racial innocence, whereas anti-Black and other forms of state sanctioned violence are premised as protective rather than aggressive. In other words, white Christian nationalism requires the US nation state to propagate white women's vulnerability, sexual purity, and religious piety in order to exonerate both the United States and white Christians from a long-standing history of racialized, sexualized violence. And as you can tell, I was reading that because I'm still trying to sit with this and make sure it holds. But that is where I would like to end. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. This was outstanding in my view. Outstanding. And I want to remind everybody that they can write their questions in the chat or comments. If you wish, I can just call you up to actually unmute yourself and speak if you prefer, because there's not a lot of people. But I have to begin two of my questions. Because,
sure, yes. Should I go ahead and unshare the PowerPoint so we can see faces?
However, my first question is about this image.
Oh, sure, yes.
That's the third question. So, yeah, they're both about images. I do see very well the connection, the amazing connection. That's very clear. But there is one difference. That the second woman is very distressed. The first woman is serene and Olympic. And so I want to see if you have something to say about that.
Yeah.
My question is about the other picture. You can take it down if you like. My second question is about the other picture of the Purity Ball, which as an immigrant, as a foreigner, it was completely shocking to me.
Yeah.
Completely shocking to me. Like this wasn't, but the other one was. Because the first thing I think about it when you said father and daughter is incest. This is images of incest. This is seen in my culture as completely incestuous and absolutely